Welcome to the second part of spatial planning and disaster mitigation. In the first part, we had general and basic information about what is disaster, what is risk, what is vulnerability, and some information about what is disaster mitigation. Now, in the second part, we are going to understand how is connected to spatial planning. So how disaster mitigation can be seen as an element in urban planning and spatial planning in general. Some of the first information about spatial planning and the European spatial planning policies you can find in the e-lecture by Professor Donato Di Ludovico. So we are going to talk on the relationship between the two. And talking about with the relations of those, we have to think about the cycle of disaster and what is the level of stress that is suffered by people and by environment. With environment, I'm saying the physical environment that in our case is especially the city. What we have to consider when we talk about disaster mitigation and spatial planning, we have to think of the timeline and the cycle of disaster and the timeline and the cycle of pre and post disaster. Looking at the graphic, we can see that there are three main sectors, three main moments. The first is before, the second is during, the third is after, but after is divided into two parts. Is the immediate after, close to the event, and there is an after in the future and in peacetime. So when we look to the cycle of disaster, we can see that the first immediate phase that is really quick. If we are going to talk about before later on, but looking to what is called the phase of emergency, and is when a disaster occurs, we have a really limited time where people has to think how to survive. So the main aim is to survive and escape from an earthquake, from a fire, etc. The second is once is reached the first evacuation place, you have to think that there you can stay sometimes not only a few hours, not only 12 hours, not only 24 hours, but sometimes you can stay there for, let's say, 3 days. Then there is the life in evacuation shelter, and it depends on the countries, on the regulation of the country, but living in the shelter or in the evacuation center, it can last for 1 year. From 6 months to 1 year. In Italy is 6 months, so you can stay in the shelter in the camp for 6 months, and then you must be transferred to the temporary houses. And how many time you can stay in the temporary houses, that is the immediate after of the emergency phase, it could be 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 10 years. Sometimes it lasts forever. And it leads to the last one, because this is the expected result that you can't stay there for more than 2-3 years, and then it's better to be transferred in a permanent house or come back to your house. And then it's connected what to do with peacetime. So why we talk about cycle? Because usually the disaster doesn't hit once and then it disappears. It disappears maybe for 1 century, but then it comes back. It disappears maybe for 2 years or 3 years, but then it happens again, it occurs again in really short time. There is an example that is quite clear that I can give to you, and is regarding the earthquake here in the central of Italy, and includes also Emilia-Romagna. After the really big, severe earthquake here in L'Aquila in 2009, nobody was thinking that a second one could happen in 2012 in Emilia-Romagna, that is not so far as a region from here. But nobody expected to have a big earthquake in 2016 here, really severe, with a lot of problems, and it brought the destruction again of a lot of villages in a rural area. And even no one expected the 2017 in January, so just 6 months later. What is the meaning of what the chronology, the history that I'm giving you? Is that you must be ready and you must be educated to disaster. It's not only the fact that the disaster occurs once, but you have to work on the before, when it's peacetime, when the disaster, it doesn't occur, but we are looking that probably it will affect. So the main aim is to work on the stage before the disaster. And what do you do to working before? You do analysis, you work on data, you identify and analyze the risk of a disaster, you analyze everything that is connected with disaster, and the main task for this phase is to generate scenarios, different scenarios that can be developed and can be useful in order to understand how to, let's say, cope with the disaster. When we talk about the identification and the analysis of risk, we talk about the usual actions that are taken in this case: to collect data, to evaluate the site, to identify possible hazards, to work on the historical data related to the hazards, so what happened, and you work on what is the urban fabric, how the data about infrastructures can help you to identify or to mitigate. You made surveys, you make report, and what is the most important, you at the end identify who's affected by disaster. You have to think a second step in this analysis, because it's not only the disaster that you are going to work with, but have to look also to primary and secondary hazards. So there could be something that is generating other hazards or hazards that are in a combination. Let's give you the example of the terrible disaster that happened in 2011. That was, earthquake, tsunami, but there was a nuclear power plant that was unexpected. So you have to think about such kind of disaster, not only the earthquake and be ready for the earthquake or tsunami. And this is why you have to do all this kind of analysis and identification of data, etc., because they are related to vulnerabilities and also to all the possible negative impacts of the disaster. Then you go to the risk assessment process, identification and analysis of a disaster, we already said, and developing alternative disaster. But what is the meaning? After you have all the data, so the risk assessment is there, you have to work on development different scenarios. And this is to work on define the size and consequences and probability of the occurrence. And you also is really important in order to classify the risk level, like low, medium, and high. So the result of the scenario is linked to future actions that have to be prioritized. In order to prevent hazard, you can have different approaches in order to mitigate and prevent hazard. So the first one is you can eliminate the source of the risk, of course, or mitigate the impact of hazards. So there are some hazards that are unavoidable. So in that case, you have to adopt proactive measure. You can reduce the vulnerability of cultural heritage. We said that cultural heritage is really sensitive. They're really vulnerable to hazards. So you have to reduce the vulnerability through planning, through specific intervention that are focused on a cultural heritage. You have to engage community. And this is what is called capacity building. You cannot avoid to think about community, and you must involve them. Otherwise, they will be just a subject of some measures that you take, and they are not going to be involved in the proactive measure that will mitigate the impact of hazards. We have also the strategic level of mitigation that are leading by the urban planning and regional planning. You have physical planning measures to mitigate that are almost related with strategies for the property management, the land use management, and everything that is related with the protection of the goods. And also, you can have technical measures that are going to protect the site, and they are related with the specific disaster impact. Then we have what is after the disaster. In the future peacetime, the main task is to integrate disaster risk management into overall planning and management. And here you have 5 priorities, 5 things that you have to consider. Linking with other plans and management systems, we have a variety of different plans, and we have to coordinate them because they are regarding a specific aspect of the city, a specific aspect of the preservation of the historical, of the cultural heritage, a specific aspect of protection of natural area, and so on. So you must find a way how to coordinate and link all these plans. You have to engage the local communities. Without the people, there are no mitigation in the hazard because they will be as a sort of passive objective of the disaster. In the peacetime, in order to overall planning and risk management, what you have to use is to work on communication and to utilize a variety of communication tools and media. You have to implement. There is a sort of attitude, unfortunately, then when, because it's really expensive, is really difficult, it costs a lot of time to do it. Once you have a really good risk management plan, so emergency plan, you think it's over, I've done it. But in planning, you are working with transformability of society, of economy, and last but not least, with urbanization, with the built environment. So you have to think that there is a continuous updating of those plans. Must be constant monitoring and review from one side of the data, of the analysis of what is the state of art, of territory, and on the other hand, what are the, let's say, the connections with the society and with the community. And this is what is really concerning a lot of our cities, European cities, is all this system has to be linked with the heritage management system at the site level. In one word, you have to link everything that is connected with the city, with the territory, with the historical territory, with the specific management of historical heritage. So there are suggestions for new planning models because we have to take into consideration. Klosterman pointed out in 2003, talking about decision-making processes, that we have to be ready to leave and abandon a realistic goal for the exact predictions, because we have to think, as I said before, to alternatives, scenarios, to a range of expected, possible, probable, expected scenarios, alternative features. Not to think it will be, but what if scenarios. To reveal the model that are related to the assumptions and therefore to drive the policies choices that make explicit all the implication of adopting some policies instead of others. To build as much as possible simple models rather than complicate. I would say rather not complex, but complicate models, because you have to visualize and to use visualization as much as possible in order to explore the past of physical environment and to see how it is now and to preview or, again, to imagine possible alternative futures. And all these must be supported by fully documented data, procedures, and assumptions. So If I can go to the conclusions, when we talk about urban planning and we link it with this, what we call sustainable development, we have to think that we are working with a complexity of regulation, overlapping of multiple levels of coexistent planning, and there is a lack of collaboration and integration among them. And this is really risky because it's a risk, because it's an underestimate. The risk, because it leads sometimes to misperception, and misperception leads to criticality that cannot be solved. And without all the experts that are connected with the field of physical environment, natural environment, society, economy, and so on, the territory that usually is multi-hazard and therefore is multi-risk and therefore is suffering for overlapping of primary and secondary hazards, the management and the planning of this territory cannot be possible. So the mitigation is needed in order to preserve historical city, European cities, and the city that we have to consider as a tool in the process of constructing and transmitting the European cultural heritage with all the multicultural image and all the transnational character. In the word, if we have to think about spatial planning and disaster mitigation, we cannot avoid to include all the level of government, but a level of governance, and facing the multiplicity of the European character. Thank you.